My mother-in-law looked at my dress. Then she looked at the waiter and smiled. "Don't worry," she said loudly. "She's not staff. She just dresses like it." The table burst into laughter. I didn't laugh. I just sat there, hands folded, watching the wine in my glass move slightly, because the table had shaken when everyone laughed. It was a beautiful restaurant. Tall windows, soft piano music, crystal glasses reflecting the light. The kind of place where people celebrate success, which is exactly why we were there. My father-in-law had just closed another major deal. The company was growing again, stocks rising, investors celebrating, and tonight they were celebrating themselves. Victoria leaned back in her chair, still smiling. "Oh, Sophie," she said sweetly, "you really should let us buy you nicer clothes." My husband Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside me, but he didn't say anything. He rarely did. I looked down at my dress. Simple, black, nothing expensive, but I liked it because it reminded me of something important, where I came from. Victoria lifted her wine glass to family success. Everyone raised their glasses. "To the company," Charles added proudly, "our greatest achievement." The table filled with applause again. I took a small sip of wine, listening carefully, because every time they talked about the company, they said the same thing. "We built this empire." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was interesting. The way people repeat a story until they believe it completely. Charles leaned toward me. "You must feel very lucky, Sophie." I tilted my head slightly. "Lucky?" "Yes," he said, "marrying into a family like this." Victoria nodded. "Not everyone gets that opportunity." I stayed quiet, because sometimes silence is more useful than words. The waiter arrived with dessert, chocolate soufflé. Victoria clapped her hands softly. "Perfect," she said. "A sweet ending to successful night." She turned toward me again. "Maybe next year, Sophie, you'll learn something about business too." The table laughed again. I placed my fork down carefully, because what they didn't know was something very simple. The company they were celebrating tonight was originally mine, but they weren't ready to learn that yet. People like my mother-in-law love to talk about success, but they rarely talk about beginnings, because beginnings are messy, uncertain, embarrassing. My beginning looked nothing like this restaurant. No crystal glasses, no investors, no celebration dinners. Just a small apartment, a borrowed laptop, and a very slow internet connection. I remember the first night clearly. Rain hitting the window, the sound of cars outside, and my laptop screen glowing in the dark room. I had an idea, a simple one. A platform that could connect small businesses directly with global suppliers. No middlemen, no unnecessary fees, just efficiency. Back then, I thought good ideas were enough. I was wrong, because the first investor I met didn't even look at my presentation. He looked at me. Then he smiled politely. "You're very young," he said, "and ambitious." But the way he said ambitious felt like an insult. The second investor lasted longer. He listened for almost 10 minutes. Then he asked a question. "Who is the real founder?" I blinked. I am. He leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. Then he said something I will never forget. You should bring a more experienced partner. In this industry, people trust leadership that looks confident. I understood exactly what he meant. Leadership that looked like him, not like me. That night I walked home slowly, thinking about everything they said. About experience, about confidence, about credibility. And somewhere during that walk, an interesting idea appeared. If people didn't trust the founder, maybe they didn't need to know who the founder was. So I created a name, a simple one, neutral, professional, a name that made investors comfortable, a name that opened doors. That was the moment everything changed. Because suddenly, the same idea people ignored before became interesting. Investors started listening. Meetings lasted longer. Questions became serious. And slowly, very slowly, the company started to grow. Of course, my in-laws would later say something different. They would say the company succeeded because of their leadership, their strategy, their connections, and eventually, they started believing that story completely. But the truth was much simpler. By the time they invested, the foundation had already been built. They just didn't know who built it. I met Ethan on a Tuesday afternoon. Not at a business conference, not at a networking event, just a quiet cafe near my office. The place smelled like roasted coffee beans and fresh bread. I was sitting near the window, laptop open, trying to finish a long email to one of our developers. That's when someone placed a cup of coffee beside my table. I think this is yours. I looked up. A tall man stood there holding the cup carefully. Confused, I glanced at the receipt in his hand, then at my own order number. He was right. Thank you, I said. He hesitated for a moment, then pointed at my screen. Are you coding? I closed the laptop halfway. Something like that. He smiled. My sister does that. She says it's like solving puzzles. That made me smile a little, because that's exactly how it felt sometimes, like building something invisible, one piece at a time. Mind if I sit? He asked. I glanced around the cafe. Most tables were already taken, so I nodded. That was the beginning. Ethan was easy to talk to, relaxed, curious about everything. He asked a lot of questions, but never the intrusive kind, just simple ones. What do you enjoy doing? What makes a day feel successful? It felt normal, which was rare in my world, because most people I met were either investors or competitors. Ethan was neither. At least, that's what I thought. 3 months later, he invited me to dinner with his family. Nothing fancy, he promised. I should have known better. Their house looked more like a hotel. Tall glass doors, a long driveway, soft lights illuminating the garden. When the front door opened, a woman stood there wearing a perfectly tailored suit. Victoria, Ethan's mother. Her eyes moved over me slowly, from my shoes to my jacket to my hair. A quick evaluation, the kind wealthy people do without realizing it. Welcome, she said politely, but the word polite didn't quite reach her eyes. Dinner was served in a large dining room, a long table, heavy wooden chairs. Charles sat at the head, Ethan beside me. The conversation started casually: travel, business news, stock markets. Then Charles asked the question everyone eventually asks. "So, Sophie," he said, "what do you do?" I took a sip of water. "Technology." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "In what capacity?" I thought about answering honestly, but something about the room stopped me. The way Charles spoke, the way Victoria observed everything. So I kept it simple. "I help build platforms." Charles nodded politely. Then he leaned back slightly. "Well," he said proudly, "our family runs a technology company as well." My hand froze halfway. Something in his tone made me look up. "What company?" I asked. Victoria smiled, the proud kind of smile people use when mentioning success. "A company called Meridian." The room suddenly felt quieter, because Meridian was the company I created. For a few seconds, I didn't move. The word Meridian echoed in my head. Charles kept talking, but his voice sounded distant now, like I was hearing it through a wall. "Our company has grown faster than anyone expected," he said proudly. Victoria nodded. "Yes, it's been quite a journey." I watched them carefully, the way they spoke, the way they leaned back in their chairs, comfortable, confident, like people telling a story they had repeated many times before. "Our investors trusted our vision from the beginning," Charles continued. Ethan glanced at me. He smiled slightly, proud of his parents. And suddenly I understood something. Ethan didn't know. None of them did. Victoria placed her fork down. "You've probably heard of Meridian," she said. "It's becoming one of the most influential platforms in our industry." I nodded slowly. "Oh, I've heard of it." Charles chuckled. "Well, we practically built it from nothing." My fingers tightened slightly around the glass, because that sentence wasn't entirely true. But it wasn't entirely false either. They had helped the company grow. Their investments, their connections, those things mattered. But the foundation, the original system, the platform itself, that had come from somewhere else, from a small apartment and a borrowed laptop. Victoria studied me for a moment. "You must find business fascinating," she said. "Dating Ethan means hearing about it all the time." There was something subtle in her tone, not exactly rude, but not warm either, more like curious about whether I belonged in their world. "I suppose I do," I said calmly. Charles laughed. "Careful, Victoria. Next thing you know, she'll want to join the board." The table chuckled softly. I smiled politely, but inside, I was thinking about something else, because the board he mentioned reported to the founder. After dinner, Victoria walked me toward the door. The hallway lights were dim. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor. She stopped beside the coat rack. Then she turned toward me. "You seem like a nice girl," she said. A compliment, but the kind that carries weight. She adjusted the sleeve of my jacket slightly. A small gesture, almost motherly, almost. "But Ethan has always lived a certain lifestyle," she continued. Her voice stayed gentle, yet something underneath it felt sharp. "Our family operates in a very demanding environment. I hope you understand that." I met her eyes, and for the first time that evening, I understood exactly what she meant. She was warning me, without saying the words directly. This world was not meant for someone like me. So I simply smiled. "Don't worry," I said softly. "I understand your world very well." What she didn't realize was that I had built part of it. The first few months with Ethan were easy. We spent most of our time away from his family. Quiet dinners, late night walks. Sometimes we sat in the same cafe where we first met, the one that smelled like roasted coffee beans. Those moments felt simple, normal. But eventually, families become unavoidable. The next dinner at his parents' house was larger, more people, business partners, investors. The dining room lights were brighter this time, the long table covered in white linen, crystal glasses arranged perfectly. Victoria stood near the head of the table, greeting guests. Her smile practiced, effortless. When I walked in, her eyes moved over me again, that familiar evaluation. Shoes, dress, posture. Then she turned toward the guests beside her. "And this," she said smoothly, "is Ethan's girlfriend." She didn't say my name. It was a small detail, but I noticed. During dinner, the conversation stayed predictable. Markets, expansion, technology. Eventually, Charles raised his glass. "To Meridian." The table followed. "To Meridian." A guest across the table leaned forward. "You must be proud," he said to Charles, "building something like that from scratch." Charles nodded slowly. "Yes, it took vision." The word vision hung in the air. Victoria added calmly, "and discipline." Everyone murmured agreement. I watched quietly, because every time they spoke about Meridian, the story sounded a little more polished, a little more heroic. Stories tend to evolve like that, especially when the original author is missing. Halfway through dinner, Charles turned toward Ethan. "The board meeting is next week." Ethan nodded. "I'll be there." Charles glanced toward me. "You should bring Sophie." The suggestion surprised me. Victoria looked slightly amused. "Yes," she said lightly, "it might be educational." A few people at the table chuckled. Ethan squeezed my hand gently under the table. "He's joking," he whispered. But I wasn't offended. If anything, I felt curious, because the board meeting they were discussing was technically mine to attend. Later that night, as guests began leaving, I stood near the large windows in the hallway, looking out at the dark garden. Victoria approached quietly. Her reflection appeared beside mine in the glass. "You've been very quiet tonight," she said. "I like to listen," I replied. She smiled slightly. "That's probably wise." Then she added softly, "People who don't understand business should listen more than they speak." Her tone remained polite, but the message was clear. I met her reflection in the glass. "You're right. Listening can be very revealing." And what I had been listening to all evening was the story of a company that everyone believed belonged to them. The company headquarters stood in the center of downtown, 40 floors of glass and steel, the kind of building that reflects the entire city. Ethan parked the car in the underground garage. The sound of the engine echoed against the concrete walls. "You don't have to stay long," he said as we stepped out. "It's mostly boring discussions." I smiled slightly. "I think I can survive a meeting." Inside the lobby, everything was quiet. Polished floors, tall ceilings, soft lighting reflecting off the marble walls. A large Meridian logo hung behind the reception desk. I paused for a moment, looking at it. The same logo I had sketched years ago on a scrap piece of paper. Ethan pressed the elevator button. The doors opened with a soft chime. As we stepped inside, I felt something strange. Not nerves, more like recognition, like walking into a building that somehow belonged to me. The boardroom was on the 38th floor. Large glass walls, a long dark table in the center, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city skyline. Executives were already seated, quiet conversations, papers sliding across the table. Charles stood near the head of the table. He greeted Ethan first, then his eyes moved to me. "Well," he said lightly, "welcome to the engine room." Victoria sat beside him. She gave me a polite smile, the same one she used with guests. Ethan pulled out a chair for me near the back. I sat quietly, listening. The meeting began with numbers: revenue growth, international expansion, new supplier partnerships. Every executive spoke with confidence, like people steering a powerful ship. Eventually, the conversation shifted. One of the board members leaned forward. "There's still one issue," he said. "The founder." The room grew quieter. Charles folded his hands on the table. "Yes," he said slowly, "the founder remains difficult to reach." Victoria added calmly, "Anonymous founders can be inconvenient." A few executives nodded. "We should encourage a more visible leadership structure," someone suggested. Another executive adjusted his glasses. "Do we even know who the founder actually is?" Charles smiled slightly. "Not officially, but whoever they are, they clearly trusted our management." Several people chuckled softly. I rested my hands on the table, quietly observing, because the conversation they were having was about me. Charles stood up and walked towards the window, looking out at the city. "Eventually," he said confidently, "the founder will have to step forward." Victoria nodded. "Yes, and when that day comes, I imagine we'll finally see the person who started all of this." I glanced around the room. Everyone looked curious, almost excited, trying to imagine that mysterious person, the visionary behind the company, the architect of the platform. None of them looked in my direction. And that was the moment I realized something. They had absolutely no idea. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. More numbers. More projections. Charts appeared on the screen behind Charles. Lines moving upward. Everyone looked pleased. Success has a way of making people comfortable. Then someone knocked on the glass door. A quiet sound, but in the silent boardroom, it felt louder than it should have. Charles turned. "Yes?" The door opened slowly. A man in a dark suit stepped inside. He carried a thin leather folder. His expression was calm, professional. Victoria frowned slightly. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The man shook his head politely. "Nothing is wrong," he said, "but there is an update regarding company ownership." That caught everyone's attention. Charles gestured toward the table. "Go ahead." The lawyer opened the folder carefully. Several documents slid onto the table. White paper, heavy legal text. He adjusted his glasses. "As you all know," he began, "the founding shareholder has remained anonymous since the company's early development." A few board members nodded. "Yes, yes," Charles said impatiently. "We've discussed this before." The lawyer continued calmly. However, the founder has decided it is time to formalize their presence. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several executives exchanged curious looks. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Meaning what, exactly? The lawyer placed one document at the center of the table. Meaning the founder will now be officially recognized as majority owner. Charles blinked. Majority owner? That's correct. The silence in the room thickened. One executive whispered, "I thought ownership was divided among investors." The lawyer shook his head gently. Not entirely. He turned a page. "And the founder is present today." That sentence landed heavily in the room. Everyone looked around, scanning the table, searching for someone unfamiliar. Charles frowned. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, "but who exactly are we talking about?" The lawyer looked toward the far end of the table, toward the seat where I had been quietly sitting the entire time. "Miss Sophie Carter," he said calmly. The room froze. Victoria didn't move. Charles stared at me. Ethan turned in his chair, his expression confused. I stood slowly. The chair slid back with a soft sound. Every pair of eyes followed me. I placed my hands lightly on the table and spoke calmly. "Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie." A small pause. Then I finished the sentence. "I'm the founder of Meridian." No one spoke, because suddenly the story they had been telling for years was no longer true. For a moment, no one moved. The boardroom felt completely still. Even the city outside the windows seemed quieter. Charles was the first to speak. "That's not possible." His voice sounded different now. Less confident. More careful. The lawyer slid one of the documents toward him. "It is correct," he said calmly. "The ownership structure was established during the company's early formation." Charles stared at the paper, reading slowly. His fingers tightened slightly around the page. Across the table, Victoria hadn't spoken yet. Her expression was perfectly still, but her eyes had changed. They moved from the document to the Meridian logo on the wall, and finally back to me. And I could almost see the memories passing through her mind. The dinner table, the comments about my clothes, the quiet warnings at the door. Ethan stood slowly. "Sophie," he looked genuinely confused. "You never told me." I met his eyes. "You never asked." The room remained silent. Charles cleared his throat. "Well," he said carefully, "this is certainly unexpected." Unexpected. It was an interesting word. Because the only thing that had really changed in this room was information. I was the same person who walked into the meeting an hour earlier, the same person who sat quietly at the back of the table. The only difference was now they knew who I was. Victoria finally spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual. "You built Meridian?" I nodded once. "Yes." She looked down briefly, then back up. The confidence in her posture had shifted. Not completely gone, but different. Charles folded the document carefully. "Well," he said, "it appears we've underestimated you."
I considered that for a moment. Then I spoke calmly. No, you simply didn't know me. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, the chair Charles had been using. No one stopped me. I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I looked around the room at the executives, at the board members, at the people who had spent years discussing the company I built. I'm not here to take anything away from anyone, I said. The company grew because many people contributed. That includes all of you. Several executives nodded quietly. But there is one thing I expect: respect. My eyes moved briefly toward Victoria, then Charles. Not because of money, not because of titles, but because respect should exist before people know your success. The room stayed silent. Then I stepped away from the chair, back toward the door. Ethan watched me carefully, still processing everything. Before leaving, I turned back once. Let's continue the meeting. After all, I'd like to hear how the company I built is doing. And this time, no one laughed. So now I'm curious. If someone treated you like you didn't belong and later discovered you were the person behind their success, what would you have done?